Picture this. You're standing in the blood-soaked mud of Branxton Moor. At your feet lies a naked, mutilated corpse, violently hacked apart by English blades. Just hours ago, this was James IV, the most powerful king Scotland ever produced. Now, the scavengers ripping the armour from his body only recognise him by one gruesome detail, a rusted iron chain cutting deep into his waist. It is a penitential belt he wore for 25 years, punishing himself daily for his father's murder. Tudor chronicles call this a clean, righteous victory. The mud tells the truth of a frantic slaughter that wiped out an entire generation of Scottish nobility in a single afternoon. How did a massive, technologically advanced royal army get utterly crushed by a starving, outnumbered English militia at the Battle of Flodden 1513? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. James IV did not stumble into this slaughter. He marched south with a terrifying modern war machine. To honour his alliance with France, he crossed the River Tweed with nearly 40,000 men. He unleashed a mobile city of destruction. Heavy wagons shattered the dirt roads under the immense weight of state-of-the-art European siege cannons. Thousands of blacksmiths, armourers and camp followers marched alongside highly trained soldiers wielding 18-foot pikes. Supplying an invasion force of this magnitude required bleeding the Scottish treasury dry and stripping the borderlands bare of crops, cattle and grain. James knew the gamble was worth it. King Henry VIII was gone. He had crossed the English Channel to invade France, taking England's best commanders, veteran troops, and massive war chest with him. The English border lay exposed, defended only by ageing knights, a depleted treasury, and hastily drafted farmers. James seized the impenetrable high ground at Flodden Edge. He had superior numbers, devastating heavy guns, and absolute tactical advantage over a desperately outmatched English defence. He stood ready to deliver a fatal blow. Yet, in just a few short days, this brilliant tactician would become the last British monarch to die on a battlefield. We need to understand why King James IV risked his entire kingdom on a miserable, rain-slicked hill in Northumberland. The root of this disaster lies in a piece of parchment signed centuries earlier, the Auld Alliance. This mutual defence pact between Scotland and France basically guaranteed that if England attacked one, the other would invade from the rear. In the summer of 1513, a young and hungry King Henry VIII of England took his magnificent royal army across the Channel to conquer French territory. The French were desperate to relieve the pressure. Queen Anne of Brittany, perfectly exploiting the chivalric ego of the era, sent James a turquoise ring and a handwritten letter. She explicitly named the Scottish king her personal champion, begging him to march just 3 feet onto English soil to strike a blow for her honour. Imagine receiving a piece of jewellery in the mail and deciding to mobilise an entire nation's war machine just to prove your chivalry. Honestly, 16th century diplomacy is wild. But as leading historian Norman Macdougall famously noted, James was no romantic fool led astray by French promises. His invasion was a highly calculated strike designed to secure Scottish dominance while England was historically weak. James saw a golden, perhaps unrepeatable opportunity to end the Anglo-Scottish wars on his own terms. He didn't just summon a quick border raiding party, he activated the most expensive and complex military mobilisation in Scottish history. Let us talk about the brutal economics of this operation. Raising 40,000 men is one thing. Feeding them in the 16th century is an absolute nightmare. The Scottish Exchequer bled thousands of pounds to supply this monstrous host, practically bankrupting local lords who were legally required to equip their own retinues. James ordered every able-bodied man between 16 and 60 to muster with 40 days' worth of provisions. Men arrived dragging sacks of oatmeal, dried fish, and whatever scavenged meat they could carry. Simultaneously, the king deployed the Royal Scottish Navy, including his massive, ruinously expensive warship the Great Michael, to disrupt English maritime supply lines. At the centre of his marching column dragged the real pride of his military reforms, 17 state-of-the-art bronze siege cannons. Cast in Edinburgh, these multi-ton brass monsters required over 400 oxen to move. Hauling this artillery train through the muddy borderlands was a gruelling, agonising crawl. Men and beasts literally broke their backs pushing these guns through the relentless autumn rain. To protect the artillery, James imported French captains to drill his infantry in the latest continental tactics, creating dense, bristling hedgehog formations of 18-foot pikes that could theoretically skewer any cavalry charge. Disease, exposure and desertion began chipping away at the Scottish ranks before they even crossed the River Tweed, yet morale remained terrifyingly high. When Henry VIII received the formal Scottish declaration of war at his lavish camp in northern France, he dismissed the threat with staggering arrogance. According to the Tudor state papers, Henry sneered at the Scottish Herald and declared, "I am the very owner of Scotland, and he holdeth it of me by homage." Henry fatally underestimated the storm gathering at his back. He assumed his northern border was perfectly secure. He left his kingdom in the hands of a pregnant queen and a 70-year-old disgraced general, taking all the wealth and seasoned soldiers with him. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed a massive, heavily armed Scottish force the tactical advantage of a lifetime. While King James mobilised his terrifying war machine, a pregnant woman sitting in a quiet palace outside London received word that her adopted country was about to be annihilated. Catherine of Aragon, acting as Regent of England while her husband, King Henry VIII, paraded around France, found herself staring down an absolute military disaster. She had almost no money, no standing army, and practically zero experienced commanders left on the island. The Tudor treasury was completely drained by Henry's foreign war. If the Scottish royal army broke through the northern border, there was literally nothing standing between them and the gates of London. Most monarchs would have panicked, negotiated, or fled. Catherine went to work. She understood the cold, hard logistics of war better than most men of her time. Without funds to hire professional mercenaries, she had to rely on the archaic English militia system. She dispatched frantic orders across the Midlands and Northern Shires, demanding that every town and village raise whatever men they could find. These were not seasoned soldiers. We are talking about cobblers, bakers, and dirt-poor tenant farmers armed with rusty iron bills, polearms essentially modified from agricultural hedging tools. They had no standardised armour. Most marched north wearing padded canvas jacks and carrying a few days of stale bread in their satchels. To lead this desperate ragtag militia, Catherine pulled a 70-year-old disgraced general out of semi-retirement. Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey, was a ruthless veteran of the brutal Wars of the Roses. He was also a man desperate for redemption. His family had fought on the losing side decades earlier, resulting in the stripping of his noble titles. Surrey knew this was his absolute last chance to reclaim his family's honour. He rode north like a man possessed, gathering forces as he went. The logistical nightmare facing Surrey's hastily assembled English army was horrifying. They were marching straight into one of the wettest, coldest autumns in living memory. Supply lines instantly collapsed. The mud swallowed supply carts, and within days the English troops were starving. They had no beer, an absolute catastrophe for a 16th century army that relied on low-alcohol ale for safe hydration, meaning thousands of men were forced to drink from contaminated bogs and puddles. Dysentery began tearing through the ranks. As historian George Ridpath bluntly documented in his border histories, the English marched without bread, without drink, and without shelter, a mutinous and starving rabble held together only by Surrey's terrifying discipline. Catherine, realising the gravity of the situation, personally rode out to address a reserve force gathering near Buckingham. She ordered armour to be forged for herself and delivered a blistering speech to rally her troops, explicitly promising to lead them into battle if Surrey failed. She was funding this defence entirely on credit and force of will. By early September, Surrey's starving, exhausted militia finally reached the vicinity of the border. They were soaked to the bone, sick, and heavily outnumbered. When they looked up through the driving rain, they saw something that must have shattered their remaining morale. King James IV was already waiting for them, completely entrenched on the impenetrable heights of Flodden Edge. The Scottish artillery was unlimbered and pointing straight down the hill. Surrey had brought an army of starving farmers to fight a modern war machine, and the enemy held all the cards. Surrey finally dragged his exhausted militia into the muddy valley of the River Till on September the 7th. What the 70-year-old general saw through the driving rain must have made his blood run cold. King James had entrenched his massive army on Flodden Edge, a steep 500-foot elevation rising sharply from the surrounding plains. Deep bogs protected the Scottish flanks. The River Tweed secured their rear, guaranteeing a steady flow of grain and gunpowder from Edinburgh. James had also ordered a scorched earth policy, systematically burning every farm, mill and granary in a 10-mile radius. He weaponised the local economy, ensuring the English could not scavenge a single bite of food. Standing in the flooded valley below, the English soldiers realised their absolute nightmare had become reality. They had marched for weeks on empty stomachs and empty promises, chewing mouldy bread and drinking contaminated ditch water. Now they stared up a sheer incline bristling with 17 bronze cannons and tens of thousands of 18-foot pikes. An assault up that hill was tactical suicide. Imagine marching 200 miles in freezing rain, actively starving, just to find out your only choices are dying of dysentery in a puddle, or being blown to red mist by heavy artillery. Honestly, I would have deserted on the spot. Surrey knew his unpaid militia would completely disintegrate from mutiny and disease within 48 hours. Desperation forced his hand. He sent his personal herald, Rouge-Croix, up the hill with a formal chivalric challenge. Surrey demanded that James abandon his fortress and fight a fair, open battle on the flat plains below by Friday the 9th. It was a pathetic, transparent bluff from a starving commander. James was an educated Renaissance prince, not a fool. He laughed off the challenge. The Scottish king sent the herald back down the muddy slope, stating flatly, it did not become an earl to dictate to a king. He held the high ground. He was perfectly content to sit on his fortified throne and watch the English army eat itself alive. The Scottish encampment looked like a terrifying, impenetrable city of canvas and steel. French military advisors paced the ridges, ensuring the artillery sightlines perfectly covered all approaches. Renowned military historian John Sadler perfectly captures the absolute hopelessness of the English position on that Wednesday afternoon. He observed, Flodden Edge was a textbook defensive position, practically unassailable by 16th century standards. A frontal assault meant total annihilation. Surrey was trapped in a lethal stalemate. Retreating south meant abandoning the entire north of England to a Scottish invasion and facing the wrath of a furious King Henry. Attacking meant throwing poorly armed tenant farmers straight into a mechanical meat grinder. The rain continued to pour, turning the English camp into a foul, disease-ridden swamp. Time was completely out. Surrey needed an immediate miracle, or he needed to execute a manoeuvre so completely reckless that the Scottish commanders could never possibly anticipate it. Surrey realised a frontal assault up Flodden Edge was a guaranteed death sentence for his men. He needed a miracle, so he chose a manoeuvre so insanely reckless it bordered on military malpractice. On Thursday, September the 8th, Surrey ordered his entire starving army to abandon their camp, turn their backs to the Scottish guns, and march in a massive flanking arc. He planned to cross the River Till, march north, and cut completely across the Scottish rear. He was physically placing his small, exhausted force between King James and the Scottish border. If the manoeuvre failed, Surrey's army would be pinned against the river and slaughtered to the last man. The logistical reality of this march was agonising. Surrey split his forces into two main columns. The vanguard was commanded by his son, the Lord Admiral Thomas Howard, while Surrey himself brought up the rear. They dragged heavy baggage and field guns through sodden, muddy terrain, entirely exposing their flank to the enemy perched above them. English soldiers were literally chewing on their leather straps to stave off hunger. A single, coordinated cavalry charge from the Scottish lines right then would have ended the campaign. King James watched this desperate procession unfold from his commanding heights. His generals were practically screaming at him to attack. The master gunner of the Scottish artillery, Robert Borthwick, desperately begged the king for permission to open fire as the English vanguard bottlenecked while crossing Twizel Bridge. According to 16th century chronicler Robert Lindsay of Pitt's Cotty, an arrogant James flatly denied the request, snapping at his gunner, "I will have all the enemies before me in a plain field and see what they can do all out before me." Generations of writers have blamed this exact moment for changing the history of Scotland forever, accusing James of fatal chivalric naivety. Modern analysis paints a much colder picture. Military historian Dr. Raymond Campbell observes, James did not freeze out of outdated honour. He actively chose to let the English cross, believing he was baiting a starving, divided army into a perfect kill zone. James wanted Surrey cut off from supply lines. He wanted the English trapped against the river where they could not retreat. By Friday afternoon, the English had miraculously navigated the bogs and formed up at the base of a smaller ridge called Branxton Hill, sitting just below the main Flodden encampment. Surrey had successfully blocked the road to Scotland, but his men were dead on their feet. The trap was set. Recognising the English repositioning, James executed a brilliant rapid tactical shift. He ordered his men to abandon Flodden Edge, burn their camp waste to create a massive smokescreen, and march down to seize Branxton Hill before the English could take it. As the foul-smelling smoke cleared on the afternoon of September the 9th, the starving English vanguard looked up to see the entire Scottish Royal Army. Pikes lowered and cannons aimed, waiting for them just a few hundred yards away. At roughly 4 in the afternoon on September the 9th, the valley of the River Till physically shook. The Scottish master gunner, Robert Borthwick, finally unleashed the most expensive artillery train in British history. 17 massive bronze siege guns roared from the heights of Branxton Hill, vomiting fire and smoke into the driving rain. These were continental monsters, forged to smash thick castle walls into rubble. But as the thick white sulphur cleared, the brutal reality of physics set in. James had positioned his magnificent weapons too high. To hit the English vanguard in the valley below, the Scottish gunners had to force the heavy barrels sharply downward. When they fired, the immense recoil instantly drove the wooden gun wheels deep into the rain-soaked mud. The cannons were effectively glued to the earth, entirely unable to be re-aimed. Worse, the downward trajectory was a complete failure. The massive iron balls either screamed harmlessly over the heads of the English troops or buried themselves deep in the bog with a wet, useless thud. Reloading a 16th century siege cannon was already a dangerous, agonising chore, involving wet sheepskin swabs and loose black powder. Trying to do it while your gun carriage is rapidly sinking into a swamp is practically impossible. The Scottish guns fell silent almost as quickly as they began. The English response was terrifyingly precise. Sir Nicholas Appleyard commanded the English artillery, and he brought completely different tools to this fight. Instead of cumbersome multi-ton siege weapons, the English had dragged light, highly mobile field pieces through the mud. They were much smaller, but they possessed a devastating tactical advantage, a rapid rate of fire. English gunners could reload, aim and fire 3 times for every single Scottish volley. Appleyard's guns immediately tore into the dense Scottish formations on the hill. We have to understand what a solid iron cannonball actually does to a tightly packed block of men holding 18-foot pikes. It does not explode, it bounces. A single round shot skipping violently up the muddy slope would sever legs, shatter torsos and tear a horrific, bloody corridor straight through the Scottish ranks. Men were being butchered where they stood, unable to move out of their tight defensive formations without breaking the line. Military historian Gervase Phillips points out the cruel irony of this fatal mismatch. The Scottish king had bankrupted his treasury for weapons of siege warfare, only to find himself trapped in a fast-paced field engagement where his prized guns were practically useless. The absolute pride of the Scottish army had instantly become a massive liability. The psychological toll on the Scottish soldiers was unbearable. Standing perfectly still while unseen metal rips your neighbours apart is the ultimate test of human discipline. The Highlanders on the Scottish left flank, commanded by the Earls of Home and Huntly, finally reached their breaking point. They were proud, aggressive border warriors, not stationary targets for English gunners. They realised that staying on the hill meant bleeding to death in place. Their only chance of survival was to close the distance and slaughter the artillerymen. Without waiting for the king's order, they levelled their heavy pikes and launched a massive screaming charge down the muddy slope, plunging straight toward the English right wing. The battle of positioning was completely over. The slaughter was about to begin. The frantic charge of the Scottish Highlanders actually worked, at least initially. Lord Home and the Earl of Huntly slammed their men into the English right wing, commanded by Surrey's younger son, Edmund Howard. Edmund's raw, starving militia instantly shattered under the sheer aggression of the Highland assault. Hundreds of English soldiers threw down their weapons and ran for their lives into the bogs. King James watched this early success from his commanding position on Branxton Hill. The blood rushed to his head. He saw the English flank disintegrating and believed the entire enemy line was ready to collapse. This was the exact moment James IV stopped thinking like a brilliant Renaissance commander and started acting like a glory-obsessed medieval knight. Instead of remaining on the high ground to direct his reserves and maintain his tactical chokehold, the King of Scotland dismounted his horse. He took his place in the front rank of the central division, grabbed an 18-foot pike, and ordered his massive centre to advance down the hill. That single, impulsive decision doomed a nation. To understand why this was such a catastrophic error, we have to examine the brutal physics of 16th century pike warfare. The Scottish infantry had spent months drilling with French military advisors to fight in tight, continental-style rectangular blocks. Thousands of men stood shoulder to shoulder, creating an impenetrable hedgehog of steel-tipped ash poles. This formation is an absolute steamroller on perfectly flat dry ground. But James was ordering his men to march down a steep, uneven incline that had been completely saturated by weeks of relentless autumn rain. The descent instantly turned into a logistical nightmare. Heavily armoured men began slipping on the wet grass. The rigid ranks broke apart. When you're sliding down a muddy hill, carrying an 18-foot pole is no longer a tactical advantage, it becomes a deadly hazard. Soldiers tripped over their own weapons. The tight, disciplined formations dissolved into a disorganised, chaotic mob, struggling just to stay on their feet. By moving forward, they completely lost their momentum, their cohesion, and their reach advantage. Military historian Peter Rees bluntly summarises the sheer tactical insanity of this manoeuvre in his analysis of the campaign. The descent from Branxton Hill destroyed the Scottish army before the English struck a single blow. A pike block loses all tactical integrity the moment its soldiers begin slipping in the mud. James traded absolute tactical supremacy for the thrill of a medieval infantry charge. It is the ultimate tragedy of Flodden. By the time the Scottish centre reached the bottom of the valley, they were exhausted, covered in mud, and their formations were completely ruined. Worse, they stepped right into a marshy, waterlogged depression at the base of the hill. Their boots sank deep into the freezing sludge. Waiting for them just yards away was the Earl of Surrey and the English centre. Surrey's men were sick, hungry, and exhausted, but they held the firm ground. More importantly, they held a weapon perfectly engineered to butcher men trapped in the mud. The moment the Scottish front line collided with the English centre, the battle devolved from a tactical manoeuvre into a mechanical slaughterhouse. James IV and his heavily armoured nobles slammed into the Earl of Surrey's men at the bottom of the valley. The Scottish soldiers desperately tried to level their 18-foot pikes, but the bog completely destroyed their mechanical advantage. They had absolutely no forward momentum. They were packed so tightly together they could barely move their arms. An 18-foot ash pole is a weapon of distance. It requires two hands, firm footing, and space to thrust. Once an enemy steps inside the metal point of that spear, the weapon instantly becomes a useless, cumbersome log. The starving English militia did exactly that. They stepped right past the lethal tips. Surrey's men carried the English bill. This was a brutally efficient 8-foot polearm topped with a heavy steel axe blade, a stabbing spike, and a recurved hook. It was essentially an agricultural tool modified for close-quarters butchery. The English soldiers used those curved hooks to grab the Scottish pikes and pull them down into the mud. Then, they brought the heavy axe blades crashing down, physically chopping the wooden shafts in half. Within minutes, the absolute pride of the Scottish military was completely disarmed. They dropped their ruined pikes and drew their broadswords. The crushing press of thousands of panicking bodies made it impossible to swing a blade effectively. The English billmen simply stepped back to their optimal 8-foot range and began hacking the Scottish infantry to pieces. It was terrifyingly similar to chopping wood. The ground beneath them rapidly turned into a thick red paste. The mud was so deep and adhesive that it literally sucked the leather boots off the Scottish soldiers. Hundreds of men abandoned their footwear entirely. They fought barefoot in the freezing slime just to maintain their balance, slipping on the severed limbs and blood of their own comrades. Thomas Ruthall, the Bishop of Durham, wrote a chilling primary account of this specific melee just days after the carnage. He explicitly noted the terrifying resilience of the Scottish front ranks, reporting to the Tudor court, "Such large and strong men, they would not fall when 4 or 5 bills struck one of them." English arrows simply bounced off the imported plate armour of the Scottish nobility. Surrey's militia had to physically beat the Scottish elite to death through sheer exhausting blunt force trauma. This is the most brutal extreme of asymmetric warfare. A starving, disease-ridden militia of English tenant farmers found themselves in the exact right terrain, holding the exact right weapon to dismantle a technologically superior royal army. The Scottish soldiers could not advance. The mud prevented them from retreating. They stood their ground in the freezing bog and died in place, forming a massive, agonising wall of human flesh around their king. The slaughter in the bog reached a horrifying climax around the Scottish king. James IV realised his grand tactical vision had completely dissolved into a chaotic, primitive brawl. His 18-foot pikes were shattered. His men were slipping in the blood-soaked mud. Instead of retreating or attempting to reorganise his remaining reserves on the hill, the King of Scotland made one final desperate decision. He decided to cut the head off the snake. He locked his eyes on the Earl of Surrey's personal standard flapping in the rain and began physically hacking his way toward the English commander. I have to admit, there is a terrifying, grim romance to this exact moment. Most modern commanders, or even monarchs of his own era, would have fled the field the second their front line collapsed. James lowered his visor, gripped his broadsword, and waded deeper into the freezing sludge. He fought with the manic intensity of a man who knew he had just doomed his entire kingdom. Surrounded by his royal guard, he pushed through the horrific crush of panicking bodies, trading heavy blows with English tenant farmers wielding agricultural axes. The English lines physically bowed under the sheer fury of the Scottish elite, but they did not break. The mud was simply too thick. Every single step forward required superhuman effort. James actually made it horrifyingly close to his target. He fought his way to within a single spear length of the 70-year-old Earl of Surrey. If he had reached the English commander and killed him, the entire battle might have turned on a single medieval duel, but the English billmen converged. We know exactly how the King of Scotland died because the English meticulously documented the absolute destruction of his body. He was not taken prisoner. He was not offered quarter or ransomed like a traditional nobleman. The official Tudor state papers detail that the king suffered divers deadly wounds, and in especial one with an arrow and another with a bill. An English archer put a shaft straight through his lower jaw. As he stumbled forward, a militiaman swung a heavy iron bill and practically severed his left arm. Another vicious strike slashed open his neck. The most powerful, educated king in Scottish history was butchered in the mud like a common vagrant. His royal guard refused to abandon the corpse. They formed a tight, desperate circle around his mutilated body and fought until every single one of them was hacked to pieces. Historian Norman Macdougall captures the sheer tactical tragedy of this final charge perfectly. He observes, "James died not as a commander directing his forces, but as a heavily armoured infantryman blinded by the chaos of a medieval melee." By nightfall, the English militia had completely exhausted themselves. They stopped killing simply because it was too dark to see, and their arms were too physically tired to swing their weapons. They collapsed in the freezing rain among mountains of the dead, completely unaware that they had just executed the most devastating political decapitation in British history. As dawn broke on September the 10th, the driving rain finally stopped, revealing the true horrific scale of the catastrophe. The valley of Branxton Moor was choked with 10,000 Scottish corpses. The victorious English militia, completely exhausted and practically starving, spent the morning stripping the dead of their expensive continental armour and weapons. Back in London, Queen Catherine of Aragon received the news of her desperate army's impossible triumph. She did not express a single ounce of pity for her fallen brother-in-law. Instead, she ruthlessly secured her political victory. She took the blood-soaked, violently slashed surcoat of King James IV and shipped it across the English Channel to her husband, Henry VIII, the Cis. Her accompanying letter remains a chilling masterpiece of Tudor statecraft. In this, your grace shall see how I can keep my promise, sending you for your banners a king's coat. She practically shamed her own husband by winning a massive kingdom-saving defensive war while he was merely playing conqueror abroad. The Battle of Flodden was not just a military defeat. It was a demographic extinction event for the Scottish ruling class. Along with their brilliant Renaissance king, the freezing mud claimed 3 bishops, 11 earls, 15 lords, and thousands of knights, clan chiefs, and local magistrates. Every single noble family in Scotland lost a father, a son, or a brother that afternoon. The national mourning was so profound, it birthed the haunting Scottish pipe tune, "The Flowers of the Forest," a lament for the generation wiped out in the bogs. The economic and logistical fallout completely paralysed the nation. Local economies instantly collapsed because the landowners, merchants, and regional administrators were all dead. Governance ground to a total halt. Estates were suddenly run by grieving widows desperately trying to manage agricultural production without manpower. Prominent historian J.D. Mackey brutally summarises the sheer gravity of the aftermath. Scotland was left to the rule of a weeping widow and a toddler king, her political machinery shattered by the loss of an entire generation of experienced men. It honestly blows my mind how completely a nation's destiny can pivot in a single chaotic afternoon. James IV held superior numbers, state-of-the-art artillery, and the impenetrable high ground. He lost his life and his kingdom because he allowed the intoxicating rush of a romantic medieval infantry charge to override the cold, brutal realities of physics and terrain. The English militia survived because a desperate, disgraced general forced an exhausting flank march, and because ordinary tenant farmers used modified agricultural tools to pull heavily armoured aristocrats into a freezing swamp. The slaughter at Flodden Field remains one of history's most brutal masterclasses in asymmetric warfare. It proves definitively that superior technology and overwhelming numbers mean absolutely nothing if a commander misjudges the ground beneath his feet. If you found this breakdown of the day Scotland lost its greatest king fascinating, please hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Tell me down in the comments which historical battle or military disaster you want me to analyse next, and if you want to explore another incredible story where a massively outnumbered force completely humiliated a royal army. Click the video on your screen right now. I will see you over there.